boa tarde. Bem-vindos a mais uma sessão das aulas abertas aqui na Escola das Artes da Universidade Católica Portuguesa. Enquanto estamos nesta situação pandémica, faremos estas aulas abertas online. Esperemos que depois das férias da Páscoa possamos voltar ao regime de estar fisicamente aqui na Escola das Artes no Porto. As aulas abertas este ano são sobre arte, pensamento e som, e connosco hoje nós temos uma artista e uma pensadora que nos vai falar também à volta desses temas, e eu vou agora passar para inglês, já que esta aula vai ser feita em inglês. So with me I have Salomé Voegelin. Salomé is an artist, writer and researcher engaged in listening as a social political practices. She writes essays, books and text scores for performance and publication. Her most recent book, The Political Possibility of Sound, Fragments of Listening, Bloomsbury 2018, continues a research on listening and its social, cultural and political power that she started in her two previous books, Listening to Noise and Silence Towards a Philosophy of Sound Arts, 2010, and Sonic Possible Worlds, Hearing the Continuum of Sound, 2014. The 10 years between these books have shaped a new ground in which, as Voegelin states, sound and sonic thinking has really gained ground in how we engage with things, how we know the world, not only visually, but increasingly also by its sound. Voegelin's practice engages in participatory, collective and communal approaches. She co-governs with Mark Peter Wright the regular cross-disciplinary listening and sound-making events Point of Listening in London, and since 2008 she collaborates with David Moulin in a practice that reconsiders social, political, architectural and aesthetic actualities and sites through the possibilities of sound, things, voices and texts. As a researcher, she works at the forefront of new knowledge economy established by sound studies and sound art. She is the principal investigator of the UK Research Council funded project Listening Across Disciplines that turns to the invisible and mobile dimension of the world to explore its cross-disciplinary potential. Voegelin is a professor of sound at the London College of Communication, University of the Arts London, and currently represents a professorship in sound studies at the University of Fine Arts, Braunschweig. In the opening of her book, Sonic Possible Worlds, Voegelin says, "The recording in words of what I hear does not invite the recognition of an object or a subject, but triggers a generative interpretation, the production in the reader's auditory imagination of what it might have been that I heard, what he might remember to have heard, or might go on to hear as a possibility of my words under present auditory environment." This phonographic writing notates not a solipsistic listening, however. Listening is never separate from the social relationships that build the fleeting circumstances of hearing. Rather, listening inhabits that circumstance, and thus, my room transcribes not the heard in isolation, but composes its sociality, the hearing of myself in the social context of a room, my soundscape, a position, and its consequence, which these words are trying to reflect on and share." End of quote. It is by an exploration of the experience of listening that Voegelin challenged our common perceptions of sound and music in our historical present. Salomé Voegelin presents us today the talk To Know from the Invisible. As she presented, in this lecture seminar, we will explore the sense and form of sonic knowledge and discuss what it might bring to discourse and to our understanding of the world, of art and of ourselves. The aim is not to disregard the visual, but to see it in a different light, and the intention is not to ignore difficult or dangerous interpretations, but to realize the construct of every way we know. Salomé, thank you very much for being with us today, and the stage is yours. Salomé, you just went blank.
And I just trying to repeat, and through repetitions and moving forwards, we're going to get there. So I was just ironically talking about the silver linings of this is that we've become very computer literate and have become very used to
Parece que a ligação está mesmo muito fraca. Nos testes que fizemos antes parecia tudo estar bem, mas agora na hora da verdade. Salomé, you are back.
Okay, well, this is really difficult.
No,
I have no idea what you've heard or what you haven't heard.
No, but we didn't heard anything when you started again.
So you didn't, why did you, am I just falling out so much that it's almost pointless, or what is it?
I would ask if you, maybe we can try again. So let's see if this continuously is happening. Maybe we have to cancel, but let's try one more time.
How about switching off the cameras? Could that help? So that I'm just speaking like a podcast.
Okay, maybe we can try the not sharing your PowerPoint.
Okay.
Okay, Salomé, let's try to know if that's better.
Okay, and then if that doesn't work, we can stop sharing the cameras and
just
and
hearing
hope
sound.
That the voice can still carry something. I'm really sorry about that, but I am now on Ethernet. I can't. I mean, my signal is very good on my side, so I'm surprised.
So sorry, you have to do something.
I have to do something.
João. Okay, just a moment, Salomé. Okay. Yeah, just technically putting you back in the picture.
Okay.
Your camera. But now it seems more steady. So can we start from your point, from the régie? João? Segundo. Okay, just a second, Salomé.
Cool.
Okay, we are ready. So maybe I can ask you if you can start from the very beginning.
Okay.
And let's start from zero, okay?
Yes,
thank you.
Yes. So in the beginning, I thanked you, Daniel, for this very generous and very well contextualizing introduction on my work and my ideas, on which I will work through this particular emphasis on to know from the invisible. Now that we've lost the PowerPoint, I will simply try to conjure for you the images or the texts and the prompts you would be seeing were you to be seeing my PowerPoint, which I actually think in the context of to know from the invisible is a very interesting concept. And I will try to make this as useful as possible. So we all have to participate much harder with our imagination for my voice into some idea of what you would have seen had you seen the PowerPoint. I also thanked Diogo Tudela for inviting me to this series of events at the art school, the School of Arts in Porto. I'm really delighted to be part of this series of lectures on art through sound.
Certo. Salomé, we lost you again.
Okay.
I don't know.
My internet is really good. I've just checked it. I have a really stable, really fast internet. I'm on the Ethernet cable. I do not know. I don't know where the not.
Maybe switching off your camera a little bit and try to see if that helps.
Yeah, if we maybe
just sound.
If we both switch them off, because obviously every camera. Yeah, I can try. I switch it off. But it would make sense to switch yours off too, just so that there really is no.
Well, I'm not the one that will switch off.
Not your own camera.
So, but my technical team will do that if they feel that it's important.
Okay. All Right. So would you like me to restart?
No.
Yes,
You can just go
continue where I was.
after Diogo Tudela.
Yes.
You can go. Yeah.
Okay, so I was sort of saying about how the situation was when he invited me in October 2020, and when there was a hope that this meeting would take place in a room together, and we could maybe explore some notions of a sonic knowledge more participatorily together. And now it has ended up as a talk with visuals, and now it has ended up as a talk without visuals, without anything. So a very interesting challenge. But I tried to focus on, despite everything,
Bom, parece que a ligação está realmente muito fraca hoje e eu acho que neste momento se calhar vamos suspender esta sessão e vamos ver se é possível voltar ou não com a sessão. Por isso, até já e deixem-se estar ainda um pouco por aí a ver se é possível. Em 10 minutos voltaremos a esta sessão. Olá, boa tarde de novo. Já conseguimos resolver os problemas técnicos e vamos optar por uma nova solução tecnológica. So I have Salomé again with us. Salomé, I hope now this will work. So I give you the word. Thank you again for your patience.
That's okay, yes. So I don't have to say all my thank yous again, although they are heartfelt and they remain. And it is interesting that we now continue in a new room. And that this has become possible. I mean, I was just talking about, or trying to talk about, silver linings and new things that are, beneficial about the COVID crisis, i.e. the possibility to meet people in Portugal, to meet people all over the world without ecological impact of flying around the world and without economic barrier of just simply not being able to go there. So this is the one thing I feel I have enjoyed during this time, this just a growing network of people who are interested in sound and listening and who want to talk and share about what it could bring to the world if we would all incorporate that more in our sensibilities about who we are, where we are, and how we interact with each other, and whether we could also bring it to the knowledge table, to the idea of how we can know the world, how we can know ourselves and how we work and how we live in the world. There is this there's sort of two streams, I feel, of feelings at the moment around me. Those who are very pessimistic that once we come out of this lockdown, we will have made huge steps back into how we interact with each other and how we can sense and know of each other, because we've spent so much time on this medium, like this one now, Zoom, which suppresses noise, which suppresses anything it doesn't consider semantically relevant. So all the other knowledges, the breath, the movement on clothes, any other sounds, it fades out or it filters out, and it also has artificial intelligence system that increasingly teach it to phase those out. And that is, I think, very difficult for us to then know, well, how can we know? How should we know? And others who feel, no, it will all be different and it will all be exciting and we will have new ways of interaction. And I feel I'm standing a bit between them at times. In these difficult times, I feel, no, it is true. We will go back to a sort of 70s model of authority and knowledge. This idea that somebody stands in front of you and tells you how it is. Whereas I think since the 70s, we've worked very hard to make knowledge a participatory and a communal thing, at least within teaching and academia and pedagogy, or at least within some streams of it. Not all of them may be. But I also don't think we need to maybe throw everything out. I mean, some of the things we've gotten to during this time, maybe more empathy, understanding, hopefully more collaboration, or at least a desire to be with each other will remain. So I will use this talk as an opportunity to follow this discussion and follow my own ruminations on knowledge as they have happened over this time, and to kind of think a way in which where we are right now and where we have been over the last 12 months brings knowledge into a different space and into a different thinking with sound as well as without sound. Because if the pandemic tells us one thing very clearly, we live in a connected world with connected problems. And these problems are, interestingly enough, with the pandemic, invisible problems. We can't see the viruses. And so a sensibility to invisible knowledge might really help us to understand its impact, its spread, how we could behave. So crossovers can be made between the cultural knowledge and how we live together and move in the world and what impact that has on something like a pandemic, and also a more medical or ecological knowledge on these connections. Because sonic knowledge is always about the connections and how things connect and how things interrelate. And the pandemic, interesting enough, is of course all about how we relate. That's why we have to wear masks. That's why we have to stay at home in order not to relate. And how we not only relate to each other, but also how we relate to our environment, to animals, to other things in the world. So I think it is a good juncture, a good moment we are at the moment to consider, to know from the invisible, what we can know from the invisible, and also how we can know the invisible, which so clearly impacts on us so very much. I want to do, or I will, rather than want to, I will start off though with a few fears, or with a few anxieties I have in terms of knowledge about being on this platform now almost on a daily basis, relating to everybody on this platform. And in many ways, I feel there is a shrinking knowledge pool, because what we're missing out on is the serendipity and the surprise, the chance meetings, those things that just sort of happen if we go out, where we see something or hear something we would have never expected to encounter, and the knowledge that brings into our lives and the knowledge that it makes us think about. So at the moment, we're living in this echo chamber where everything is much more closed off, where maybe we only read what's online on Facebook, in the newspapers, and it seems to have consolidated itself somewhat, maybe also surprisingly around national lines, because who goes out there and reads foreign newspapers? Very seldom, even though online, of course, they would be available to us. So the shrinking of the knowledge pool and the shrinking of our surprising world and the serendipitous world. And it also cancels an embodied and the sensory knowledge. We're not in the room together. We cannot know through embodied knowledge, through a tacit knowledge, through the sensory knowledge of each other in this room. This is a very sanitized room you're in. I can't see you. I have to assume you're there. And I see nobody. And apart from my slideshow, so again, I'm completely capped in this mirror that I'm in, which can make this very difficult. And if we were in a room together, that would impact very dramatically on how we understand what somebody's saying or what somebody's talking about. That also curtails a communal knowledge and then local knowledge. I am not with you in Porto. I have a memory of being in Portugal, but I'm not there with you now. And we're not experiencing this as a communal and contingent knowledge-making moment. So I think it's very important to keep that in mind, that we cannot have a collective participatory experience and knowledge making in a way that I would have probably hoped to do with you. Could I have traveled? Could I have been with you? And what is really problematic about that is that there are already, even before the pandemic, issues about the hegemony of knowledge and the singular authorship of knowledge as a very epistemologically secured white Western field of what we believe, particularly in scientific knowledge, what we believe to be true, how we assure the justification and the legitimization of knowledge, what we believe is real and true knowledge. And I'm not talking about an alt-right untruth, but I'm talking about alternative knowledges of the local, the communal, the embodied, the tacit, that are switched off, even more than they already were in this knowledge paradigm of the Zoom or the whatever meetings you have experienced. So the tautology of a closed room also reinforces maybe or stops us disrupting hegemonic knowledge systems and to decolonialize knowledge as much as we're trying to pluralize it and bring new voices on the table, not maybe to erase knowledge, not at all, but to augment it, to pluralize it, to bring more to it. So the task is a difficult one, to speak to you on this sanitized medium and to make you feel as much as think about where the knowledge from the invisible could be and what it could do. So I thought, despite all of that, and I have no idea whether this is going to work on this medium, but we're just going to do it anyway, and maybe we will not hear a thing, but at least we're doing it together. So if it is possible to kind of feel at least that we are together in a room here, I'd like you to switch on your mics if you are allowed to by the host, I have no idea, and make a sound. Make any sound you can, but I do not know. Can people switch on their mic? Are they allowed?
I don't know. Are they allowed to make sounds? People.
What does the technical team say? Are we allowed?
I'm waiting. Sim? E vocês podem abrir agora isso? We have a lot of people in the Zoom meeting. Let's see
Okay.
if they can do something.
Okay, otherwise we just all do it on 3 and we just do it and we lean into the inaudible to imagine each other.
Okay, it seems Diogo will do something.
I'm here ready to make a sounds.
Okay, shall we just do it?
No, wait a little bit because they are
Okay.
putting people
In the room, okay. Yeah. I'm sorry, I had no conception that it would be difficult. I apologize.
But this is nice, this is nice. Está toda a gente, pessoal?
Sim.
Sim?
Sim.
Okay,
Sim.
you can do it, Salomé. No.
Okay, so we do 1, 2, 3, and we all just make a noise. Any noise you like to make. Okay. 1, 2, 3. So at least we sort of heard each other, and hopefully within these non-semantic. So thank you very much for taking part in this little Zoom sound experiment. And we've sort of heard each other, and we have a sense of each other beyond just the semantic or just understanding what I say, but actually as bodies with breath, with air, with the ability to make sounds. But I do want to stress that when I talk about sound and listening and sounding and listening, I do not mean an essentialized materiality, and I do not mean it to be exclusive in relation to hearing diversities, let's say. That I think that the sounding and listening that I talk about is also a sensibility and is also a concept that is done by the whole body, and that is done as a thinking of the world in relation to this bodily and relational experiences of the invisible. So it's not about a skill, a virtuosity of listening or sound making, and it's not about a physiological ability, an ear listening only, but it is a listening as a whole body experience and as a conceptual understanding of us being together in this sound at that one moment and activated in this sound as a group who at this moment is trying to think about knowledge from the invisible. So I'm very glad you humoured me and you took part in this. And of course, this would be a very different situation had we done this in a room together, maybe even walking around and really being with each other. And I'm also not quite sure, interestingly, I got a message up saying, oh, do you want to play music? So Zoom tried to understand what we were doing at this moment. It tried to understand it as something that was recognizable to its language, that it could comprehend as something it could know. And of course, it would have probably tried to get rid of the noise of what it would have understood as noise and brought us back our voices cleansed through the system, which I think is very interesting. And it brings me to an author I appreciate very much in this regard, which is Adriana Caballero, and her writing on language and speech and the knowledge that is in speech, and how in the Western tradition that speech, that sound, that breath that we have just practiced has been suppressed. And I have the book with me, and you see a picture of the book there, and I just want to read a very short, brief moment of it that I find very interesting. So in Plato's view, by contrast, thought lies in the head, so rather than in our lungs that we've just tried out together. At least in this sense, Plato anticipates a scientific framework that is more familiar to us now. Obviously, after Kant, we have a very head-based epistemology. Obviously, it is indisputable that one thinks with the brain, not with the lungs, from a scientific point of view. Homer and the other representatives of the ancient world are incorrect. I wouldn't say incorrect, I would say they had a different sensibility. From a more general point of view, however, it is interesting to note how this curious adventure of the physiological imaginary, narrated by Onion, she talks about Onion earlier, and this thinking through the lungs, as a thinking, as a coming to knowledge and coming to thought through the lungs. And here she says, this imaginary resonates with the advent of metaphysics and the devocalization of the logos, so the devocalization, the taking away the voice from knowledge, from thinking, in the scientifically correct move from the lungs to the head. It is not only the seat of thought that is at stake, but also and above all, the sovereignty of thought with respect to speech. And I would say the sovereignty of thought in respect to the body, to our bodies as agencies that live with other bodies in the world, in relationships and in relations that are of an invisible nature and how we move. And so Adriana Caballero in this book, in various ways and wonderful ways, talks about how thought in the Western world has abandoned this breath and this exhalation and the movement of the non-semantic with and through the body. And in many ways, reading it inspires me as a sound artist and as a thinker through sound to exactly have more of that breath and have that knowledge that comes from the invisible, that is between us and that is maybe not entirely seen. And again, if we were in a room together now, this would probably be an excellent moment to do a sonic meditation with Pauline Oliveros. This is one of my sort of favorite ones, and it is surprising how it always works. I will read it out and you just have to imagine it, what would happen. So we would listen, and during one breath we would make a sound, any sound. Oh, and I wrote make a sound. And then we would breathe and listen outwardly for a sound and breathe again and make exactly that sound that someone else has made in the room as we would be walking around making these sounds. And then we would be listening inwardly, breathe again and make a new sound that no one else has made in the room. And breathe and continue this cycle. So back to picking up a sound that's already in the room and making a new sound. And it is fascinating that when you do this meditation, you can really do it until there are no more new sounds in the room. And that is truly what I have experienced happening, that walking around with a group of people doing this, you start to breathe together and you start to sound together. And the sense you make with each other, like in an improvisation, if you do music together, becomes something that comes together not through semantic sense and meaning and not through a sort of pre-given recognition of something, but from the breath and from the sound we do outside the semantic. And it brings you to a knowledge of a collective practice, of how we come together to meaning, of how we come together to sense from the breath. So in a way, in many ways, I'm connecting Adriana Caballero to Pauline Oliveros here and her breath in that sort of pre-Platonic breath of the onions to sort of think with the lungs, or the idea that we can think with the lungs and bring this into a sound meditation to really practice a thinking with the lungs. And I think we come to an embodied and a tacit and a practical knowledge that is certainly for an artistic practice extremely exciting. So what does that mean? It means you would have a collective knowledge and a participatory knowledge and a communal knowledge that is not based on a semantic outside of that community or that precedes that community, but that is made and conjured in that community from the lungs, from the breath, from the sounds, and from feeling and hearing each other in a rhythm going through the rooms. And I find this collective practice, which is very often excluded in scientific knowledge, again, scientific knowledge, which obviously strives for objectivity and for the mind, for something that is repeatable and reliable, and that does not involve the body as a breathing, open, unreliable figure, but as a measurable thing, as a measurable figure that is close, that is individuated, that can be taxonomized and categorized as a man or a woman, as a child, and so on, that has a meaning through lexical and taxonomical criteria, not through the breath, which confuses it also terribly. But this collective working with sound is exactly what Mark Peter Wright and I are very interested in when we do our points of listening workshops. And Danielle has mentioned them in the first introduction when we were still in the other room. The Points of Listening was before the pandemic, a monthly workshop that we did, hosting all sorts of artists, scientists, thinkers, writers, whoever wanted to give this format a go, of collective and participatory sound making and listening in order to understand exactly how knowledge is a matter of the in-between and how knowledge is something we create together. This is an image which you see right now of such a workshop at the De la Barbarian in England. It's in Hastings. It's a wonderful sort of Art Deco building that has some really great art exhibitions, and we did this about careful listening in conjunction with Mikhail Kariki's work that was installed there at the time. So also a sound work that already had, of course, sensitized and sensibilized people to sound. And you see people apart, you see people not close with each other, to understand that exactly the sound or who we are in sound is not this or that. It's not you or me, but it's the sound we share. And this volume of sound that is between us and that we do together, where it meets, rather than as it comes out of my mouth or goes into my ears, but here in this middle space between the people you see there. There are many ways in which we do these workshops or host these workshops, because obviously they're done by very fantastic artists and thinkers. Oh, I spelled Sarah-Hughes' name wrongly there. That is, of course, a GH there at the bottom. And one workshop I want to maybe clarify that particularly through is Sarah Hughes' workshop from 2017 called Performing Objects, where she'd invited us, quite a small group, because the hosts can specify how many people they'd like to work with. We were 16 on the evening, and they all had to bring an object that didn't make sound, but that we would compose with in the sense of how we would organize these objects, how they would start to relate to each other, and how we would start to relate to each other, what sounds we would make while doing these movements, and how we would come to know these objects and ourselves as a group in a completely new way by using improvisatory techniques to work on these objects. And how we come to know each other and what we do together. So in a lot of the points of listening workshops, it is about, they all have different themes, but what is sort of the themes that are shared by all of them is the fact that we reconfigure how we can know what is being presented and how we can engage in what's being presented through embodied and tacit experiences, sensory experiences, rather than by somebody playing us a piece of work or performing a piece of work, nor by somebody just telling us something. We need to take part in order to come to this invisible knowledge and understand how we are part in it, how we are enmeshed in what we know and how we know. So in this particular workshop, and it was interesting because later in fact, last year, I sort of caught up with her and interviewed her about this. You know, can you remember? And she said, no, I don't remember. I didn't record it. And I don't actually write down, she said, what exactly it is she tried to do. But there was for her 3 terms that she brought back to me, which was she wanted to weave a sociability. So she wanted to bring together a sociability in how we are together. She wanted to perform manifestations of mutuality. So how we are, how this works, us together. And she wanted to find a common language, but beyond the semantic, so that we wouldn't necessarily speak about how we understand this object now, but by careful and placing together and by the sounds we made and the objects made, we would get to this. And I still like very much these ways, these modes of working, to understand something we think we know very well and knew, and to also remove it maybe from a functional value that it might have. Most objects to us have a function, and we approach them and are orientated towards them because of that function, what we want to do with them, even what we want to do with other human beings. Rather than, no, what is it? What does it do? How can I understand it? And how can I understand it in relation to myself, not just in relation to my need and want? And I think that is very interesting to me. And obviously now the big questions, how do you continue that in a pandemic? How do we get back to this? How do we get back to such a workshopping? How do we get back to such a knowledge? And how can that really gets us to the invisible and how we can know from it? So what knowledge and whose knowledge? Because when we do exercises, workshops or artwork, as you might do as art students, with collective and communal knowledge, the question very soon comes, well, who's the author of this knowledge? Was it Sarah Hughes? Was it us, Mark Peter Wright and myself, who organized the event? Who is the author of the knowledge, and what knowledge is it actually? If it is not measurable, quantifiable knowledge, what kind of knowledge does it bring? And these questions are really interesting to me, and I think very important to me, particularly the question on authorship. Whose voice is excluded in knowledge discourses? Whose voice isn't there? So as I said before, the knowledges that are often included are the tacit knowledges, the knowledges we have because we do something very often, and we understand them because of that repetition, rather than because we've read a manual. Embodied knowledge, again, that has to do with how we are in the world and how we experience something bodily, physically. Communal knowledge, participatory knowledge, knowledge that we build together as a community, that we have of each other and with each other. Contingent knowledge, knowledge that is of the moment, that is just right now, a knowledge that I have to understand this particular situation, rather than a knowledge that it is always like that, or it is always like that. And I think particularly art works very interestingly with contingency and with contingent knowledge. And sensory knowledge, a sort of knowledge that comes from sensing and feeling something, experiencing something as a knowledge. And these are the knowledges which our sort of more objective system overrides. It understands them as not objective enough, non-systematized enough. It doesn't fit into a scientific paradigm, even though when you speak to scientists, they very often actually do quite wild things. But then afterwards, it has to be systematized. It has to be evaluated within clearly understandable frameworks. And so it becomes excluded. It stands in excess. It becomes ignored. It's the overflow of the central discourse. It's not taken seriously, and it cannot gain a voice. And that is exactly where I would place you as art students, crucially, on the kind of fight to give that knowledge a voice, to become clear of a responsibility as artists, that there is a knowledge to be had about the world and how we live together, that the pandemic has made ever more important and urgent, and artists can really work there to make us understand this non-objective, the non-systematized, as an excess that is a positive negative, that is something that can in a very exciting way, bring us to new knowledges and new understandings and a more pluralized sense of how things are. These are just some pictures to illustrate. We are extremely visually entrained culturally in Europe and in the Western world. There are maps, which is a kind of a writing of the world. If we go with somebody like Doran Massey, they are a science as a writing of the world, and the clarifying and a belief that no, this is exactly how it is. This is how these countries are. So we have a map of the British Empire and the map of the German Empire, and we see already how in this language of knowledge and the cartographic and the geographical knowledge, what power there is. It is not neutral, and the effort to suppress the excess and the overflow is not without ideology. There is a design and an interest and a desire in suppressing those knowledges because they confuse the clarity of these visual knowledge devices that we can see here and that we learn in school to read very well, or graphs. We understand how to read graphs, what we deal with this knowledge. And when it comes to sound, the excess, it can be reconstructed into a spectrogram that can be read on visual lines, and where we can see what we need to see, and the rest is just not important and is not part of it. The recording will not be replayed once it has been translated, visualized, systematized, transcribed into something that can enter a visual knowledge discourse. But my excitement lies with the excess, it lies with the overflow, it lies with the invisible and what we could know from there. And I am with that with Michel Serres. Grammar and language create a world in their own image. And I would say, and sound creates another image of the world from its invisible depth. And that is exactly, I think, where we can find another knowledge or other knowledges that can augment and go beyond the taxonomized, the objective knowledge strains. So it's between the books. It's in the in-between as much as it is in between people. It is in between the books. It is in between conventional knowledge. So we have to look somewhere else. We have to listen, in fact, listen in conceptually and physically, actually, and for possibilities to hear beyond our visual entrainment, which orientates us in a very particular way towards the world. What falls out of objective knowledge? What isn't there? And one of the books I really like in this regard, I've also, and I will talk about that recently, come to review that a little bit, is Jean-Luc Nancy's idea of listening, and how he brings us to this, what I sort of place somewhere in the depth and in between the books, the secret. So in this book, Listening, he talks about, what secret could this bring? So I could actually briefly read this too if I get my glasses out again. It's in the very first few pages. In fact, on page 5, he asks two, to me, vital question. What secret is at stake when one truly listens? That is, when one tries to capture or surprise the sonority rather than the message. So he talks about a secret. So that knowledge I'm after is, in his terms, sort of phrased as a secret that we could get to. And the other indissociable aspect will be, what does to be listening, to be all ears, as one would say, to be in the world according to listening mean? So again, this sort of question, well, if we say there is this new knowledge in the invisible, or this different, this other knowledge in the invisible, how can we get there? And what does it mean to be according to this listening? And what secret could we get to? So he sees this invisible knowledge that I talk about as a secret. And I find that quite enticing, of course. But then I have also recently reviewed it a little in relation to hunger, listening, and knowledge. So far, I've always felt, well, we just have to listen more. We have to listen, become excited about listening and listen more and listen attentively and listen in different guises and just be, and I often even mention the word, I think, hungry about listening. Until I read this book, Hungry Listening, by a wonderful author called Dylan Robinson, who writes about listening from an indigenous perspective, so one of these sort of indigenous knowledge, communal knowledge. And all of a sudden, this hunger for listening and desire for secrets takes on a different shape. In general, hungry listening privileges recognition of a palatable narrative. Oops, I can't read why these pictures in my mind. Narratives of different. But resisting from forms of hungry listening also entails dislocating the fixity. Sorry, I need to move this image. And goal-oriented technology of listening with more flexible listening practices that situate listening as a relational action that occurs not merely between listener and listened to, but between the layers of our individual positionalities. So the reason I'm bringing up Jean-Luc Nancy and this book is because it has helped me to think, however excited I am about the knowledge of the invisible as a secret that we can uncover, the caution I feel now about being too hungry for this secret, as then just kind of agreed to have a secret rather than to be restlessly with listening without an outcome, without getting to a secret, with a knowledge that is continuous and continuously unfolding, that is not fixed, that doesn't look for fixity, but that looks for engagement and participation. So that in fact, to go back to points of listening, there is no outcome to Sarah Hughes's workshop or to the workshop at the Delaware Pavilion. There isn't a knowledge that we have gained through doing it. Because the knowledge, if we're not out to capture a secret, which is itself a colonial term, and if we're not out to fix something, however much through practice, but if we are engaged in listening as a knowledge process, we'll never get to a secret as one secret, but we will always be in the invisible and kind of activate the invisible and the rationality of the invisible again and again. And so I find that interesting that in the past few weeks, I have moved from my love for the secret and my desire for the secret into maybe a more nuanced consideration of, yeah, it's not about getting there. It's about the practicing of knowledge in this sense, to really be inclusive of indigenous, communal, local, and plural knowledges. So if Robinson suggests that it's also between layers of positionality, so how we are differently positioned in the world, this knowledge that we get to if we listen without fixing anything. It is also, I add to him in a way, in paying homage, it is also between layers of actuality of a seemingly singular world and its possibility with our possibilities and the possibilities of what and how we can know. So that this listening to a secret without wanting to grasp it, without wanting to get there, but just with open ears and a restless open ear in participation, that we can appreciate the possibilities of what and how we can know. So in effect, at this moment, it is a process that I'm suggesting rather than an outcome. This obviously is, and I think I have actually mentioned that quite clearly in response to or in relation to the anxiety that objective knowledge and scientific knowledge and Platonic knowledge, our Western knowledge has of the tacit, the embodied, the sensorial, and the criticism of the term immersivity that happens a lot in sound studies and sound arts discourse, where immersivity is criticized and where sound knowledge is discounted and considered not as legitimate or reliable because it's immersive, meaning it is sensorial or even sensual. It is just a feeling. It is an emotion. It is not a legitimate knowledge. And so recently I have found, well, maybe the word immersive is not that useful, but it is actually more about volumes, the viscous connected relational volumes we live in when we are in sound. They are not immersive in a passive, emotionally incapacitated way, this sort of sense, oh, I take some drugs and just listen to something and feel completely gone with it and uncritical, which is a frequent critique of music and sound as a sort of a dampener of criticality. But if we speak of volumes, that we are, I don't mean decibels, I mean the voluminous sphere which sounds in its invisibility makes apparent to us, this volume between people or the volume that people are in together at the same time. You can maybe best imagine it if you think of an indoor swimming pool where all the sounds are very reverberant and very particular, and where you can really almost sense a voluminousness created by the invisible of sound. But thinking it as a volume still retains a criticality about who we are in there and how we are working with this. Danielle, because we had so many moves and changes, am I running out of time very badly? Because I can't see a clock because I've got the PowerPoint up.
Yeah, I would say that you have more 10 to 15 minutes.
10 to 15 minutes.
If it is okay for you.
That's perfect. No, just so I know, because I don't want to go on and on and on. I actually quite look forward also to a discussion if that is possible, because obviously I'm talking about non-authority, so it's very important that you do not actually believe everything I say, but are very happy to enter into conversation and question my knowledge, and so we can open it up in a more participatory format. So maybe I made these jumps a bit too quickly, but I feel if science has these anxieties, as I said before, about the embodied sensorial knowledge, the communal knowledge, the local knowledge, because it does not fit within the knowledge schemes, maybe it has a different hunger. It doesn't have a hunger in the greed of finding a secret, but in constructing knowledges contingently and continually, then the notion of the immersive maybe doesn't serve sound art and sound studies, because it only highlights this anxiety and only allows those excited about objective and repeatable and consensual knowledges to say, well, yes, sound art and sound studies cannot know because it is too much about the sensorial and the emotional. And that's why I've sort of, for myself, I've started to think about more the volumes. And this is an excerpt from the book that Daniel mentioned in the beginning. Oops, that's not what I meant to do. The invisible intensity of sound creates the clammy and slowed down reciprocity that honey established and water recalls. Listening, we gain access and the ability to grasp the complex connections and processes that the automaton machine creates without having to distill and separate its actions and materialities, but from their co-production exactly. So what I'm trying to say here, particularly if you reimagine the swimming pool, is this kind of space you're in, and you know you're kind of together in this space, and sound can really make this very apparent in how things are related in a busy indoor swimming pool, that it's not just that's over there and that's over there and that's over there, but they're drawn together into one viscous voluminosity, and they create it as a co-production. So they're not separate actions, and we cannot distill the things that happen into separate actions, but they're interactions and interdependencies. This co-production involves the shared and reciprocal production of ourselves. So we are part of it. How we are in this sounding swimming pool is very different than how we are somewhere else. The sound and the carpet, I'm talking here about a particular piece by Felipe Barreno that I do not want to go into, that would be too complicated, but there is a carpet involved here, but we could just talk about the tiles in the swimming pool. They hold us in a space where we co-inhabit and co-produce the work and the architecture as an indivisible volume. So the sense of sound giving us a sense of indivisibility, which now is so very different. We're all sitting at home in front of our machines, and it's very individuated and it's very divisible. And we have this sense of divisibility. As soon as we come out of this lockdown and we go to swimming pools, or we go to parties, or we go to wherever we are together, the indivisibility of ourselves and our position in the world will hopefully become audible to us again. In this undividable dimension, or the audience is not consisting of independent selves, but as interbeings bound into the processes of its built and existing according to listening, as selves and things made of non-selves and non-things. So according to listening, obviously going back to Jean-Luc Nancy, here we are beings according to listening, where we are things, but we are also with non-things and non-selves, so with other humans, and also with the swimming pools, the air mattress, I don't know, whatever else is in a swimming pool. I haven't been for such a long time, can't remember. But we are with all these things together, and all their sounds and all our sounds mingle in this voluminous, viscous dimension. The strange, familiar elements produce each other in the rhythm of lights, the growing of yeast. And that's, again, going back to the work. But so we kind of produce each other in those volumes. And I feel that those volumes, or the voluminous, the viscous, voluminous, a conceptualization of sound like that, rather than as an immersive sphere, gives us more agency. It gives us more knowledge agency, how we experience and understand, and how we act and agitate this field, so that we can reach a participatory knowledge that we have also responsibility for, rather than maybe being immersed in something that can just give us a passive sense. I'm not saying immersive has to mean that, but I have found that that word has been exactly used at this juncture where science has tried to discredit the knowledge that can come from sound. And I felt, rather than maybe fighting the word, let's look at the word. And is there another word that can actually bring us to a more complex working? If I have a moment in time, I would actually like to play a little bit of this track. It's by Kira Mulhern, a New York-based poet and composer. It's called Self-Auscultation. And obviously auscultation, if you don't know, is the science of recording the lungs. So everything to do with your lungs is called auscultation. It's a stethoscope and then recording your lungs. And so it is. It goes to the breath, it goes to the lungs. But then, of course, as a science, auscultation writes it down and has schemas and systems to systematize what it hears and how it hears, and what is a bad lung sound, what is a good lung sound. It is interesting, though, of course, how it does involve, if it's done on human beings, it does involve touching, it does involve the flesh, it does involve embodiment. So I always find auscultation is this sort of a border study between art and the sciences. It has to permit the vagaries, the unreliability of the body, while trying to fit it into a scientific discourse and its systematizable knowledge. And I find that it's a very interesting struggle when it comes to auscultation. And I liked this piece, and I just thought, a disruption to my voice, to bring in a different breath. and a different knowledge of an exploration of her own body in a self-auscultation. Yes, a piece I've really come to like, and I think it creates that volume of the body in beyond the form, beyond the kind of visible, measurable form of the body, and then also in relation to our own breathing and being as a volume that we share together to understand bodies and spaces and knowledge from that breath, very much a knowledge and a thought from the lungs. So I'm going to jump that slide of Maurice Merleau-Ponty and go straight to the conclusion. And where I just want to conclude after this little journey is that this non-systematized sound and non-objective sound, to conclude non-systematized and non-objective sound into the knowledge process, so we might disrupt its homogeneous form and pluralize from the tacit, the embodied, the communal, the local and sensorial, what we can know and whose knowledge counts. I think that is very important to me. It is not to say the scientific objective knowledge is not right knowledge, but that disruptions and interruptions can happen and new forms can come out from the excess, from the overflow, that will also open a portal for indigenous knowledge, different gendered and racial knowledge that are all considered non-objective or not, that don't belong into a hegemonic knowledge system. And there I feel the decolonization of science could very much happen through the invisible of sound as a portal into a more plural sense of how we know and whose knowledge is part of it. And can we know without getting to the secret? Can we just keep on knowing? And what would that knowledge give us? The invisible is then not a place or an unseen. It is not something we can have. It is not a secret we can aim for or hunger for, but it is a possibility, and it is a continuous possibility that we can restlessly try to be engaged in, participate in, move in, be part of, as long as we, I suppose, accept that there might be no resolve, that it might just be possibilities of being and knowing. So this is sort of where I've landed, and I hope there are some interesting connections that can be made from here. I suppose I should stop sharing at this moment.
Yes, maybe it's better.
Stop sharing. And I'd be very happy to enter into conversation or to answer questions or to continue together.
Yeah, thank you very much, Salomé, for your talk, and we carefully listened to it, and I hope it was good also for our students. So the way that we are going to do now our conversation is that people in Zoom can raise their hands and ask for talk. And also, if someone wants to ask questions from Facebook, I also can give that question to Salomé. So if anyone hearing us from Facebook, they can also ask for talking. I have right now someone or two people asking for talk. So I will give first the voice to Miguel, one of our students.
Hi, does everyone hear me? I'm sorry.
Yeah, we are hearing you.
Thank you. Thank you, Salomé. I'm sorry if my question is a bit abstract, but I would like to ask you about the role of memory.
In certain limited sounds, it's sort of like, maybe I wouldn't call it a self-censorship, but it is a kind of practice of coming to sound together and through the relational. So I don't think that is necessarily to do with memory, but I appreciate your other question, the kind of conflation or the coming together of knowledge and memory. And I always find that sound is very evocative of memory, partly because it is invisible. And it is so sensorial that it brings with it this, or I would say it agitates us in a sort of Bergsonian way, a present memory. So it's not a memory of the past, but it's the present reconfiguration of something that's happened, maybe more like a sensorial déjà vu, that you experience something that you felt you've experienced before, but you most distinctly experience it now. So this idea of it's a memory now, it's not a memory in the past. And that's maybe also why memories are so important, because if they were truly just in the past, they would have very little agency. But given that they are a moment of now, a feeling, a memory of now, they have agency to actually impact on the present and the future. And that, I suppose, gets me to the issue of communal and recording that you mentioned. I think recording sound is a very interesting thing, because, of course, on the one hand, it legitimizes sound within objective knowledge, because I can repeat it. I can just play it back, and I can play it back. So it has, in some senses, attained at least one of the criteria of being objective knowledge. But, and maybe exactly because of memory, every replay would be different. Every replay is a different reality, is a different action in these moments of time. And that's also why it is so powerful. I find oral history, for example, when we talk about the communal and lost voices, is so very powerful exactly because it agitates something in the present I think the visual can do that too. It is just that we haven't learned to approach the visual in that way. We have very much learned to approach the visual as a reading of something separate from us that has no sensorial connection. Obviously, art tries to overcome that and create an aesthetic knowledge that creates that relationality. For me, sound can do this very powerfully, maybe a bit more immediately. But I'm not saying a visual artwork couldn't have a sonic sensibility in that regard. And that's why I also think the sonic knowledge that you speak of in terms of memory of the communal is so extremely crucial, because it can reconfigure and rethink historical knowledge and historical knowledge authors. In history, we know about the grand generals and the battles and the important people. But history is obviously much more different and plural narratives. And that's exactly where oral history recordings, for example, of history can pluralize that knowledge very powerfully. And we then have to deal with it in our current present moment rather than in the past. So I mean, I don't think I'm answering your question. I'm just saying, yes, I think you've picked out very important elements to work with in sound.
Thanks, Salomé. I must apologize to me.
Art sculpture everywhere, you know, in everywhere we go, we hear these voices, and we try to talk to them like, well, you're artists, then you're making a public sound art sculpture that we can all hear, or that is on Alexa, that is on our computers, on our phones, everywhere. And I feel the problem is if these people are left to their own devices, meaning without artistic or philosophical scrutiny and disruptions, that their idea of a natural voice and an intelligible voice never meets the ideologies of that voice, or a discussion on the ideologies of that voice. What does it mean, a natural voice? Now, obviously in the English context, it means a southern sort of Thames, you know, I don't quite know because I'm not English, but it's that kind of BBC voice, you know, that's natural, and we understand and it's intelligible and beautiful. But of course, that's a construct. If we had, for the past 40 years, been listening to a northern voice from Manchester, that would be natural and neutral and intelligible. So I think that discussion has to be had. And then the discussion has to be had, well, if the criteria of these voices are ever more naturalness and ever more intelligibility, we become ever lazier listeners. And, we kind of, I think, we obviously need these voices. There's no way around it, but we do need to confront the development of these voices with the ethics of the body and the cyborg and who is being portrayed. I mean, I would never have an Alexa at home. I do not have my children grow up with the normality of asking a woman to get them things and do it's not going to happen.
Thank you.
Thank you, Salomé.
Thank you, Diogo, also. So another question from Karina.
Hello, Salome. Good evening, and thank you for all this knowledge that you presented here. So my question is more like I'm going to explain the thing that I thought, and then I'm going to make the question. The exercises that you talked about in the beginning seem to have a very positive effect on people and to create a sense of community on those groups of people that participate. They also have a really revolutionary perception of knowledge that could help people to develop this notion of a decolonial and non-institutionalized knowledge. So how can we apply and make people like enjoy the benefits that this notion can bring to them outside the artistic and academical sort of bubble that we have? Especially in places where political and social inequality is very big. So that's it. Thank you.
Yes, thanks for the question. I think it's really important to scrutinize both the positive sense and yes, how do we get it beyond the institution and the academy? I think the power of sound, and I haven't mentioned this in the talk, you could of course also use it the other way around. I mean, you could use that very same collective, and it has been used, of course, collective knowledge to create a collective fascism, or to create collective bullying, or all manner of things. I have focused on the positive because, of course, that's not what we want. What I necessarily want to do to create a negative collectivity, but one could also explore negative collectivities and negative knowledge in that very same way. I just want to say that. But I think sticking with the positive, or sticking with what it can achieve as knowledge, what it can achieve to make us all, in a way, knowledge authors, and an understanding that we are part of knowledge, of the knowledge creation. That is not, here is the science lab and here is culture, or here are people and here's the scientist. It's scientists are people, and we are people who buy paracetamol, or we are people who get COVID. So I think we have to, obviously it can break down these boundaries and appreciate the correlationality. But how to get it out there is really a difficult question. I think the points of listening workshop that we're doing, well, they often took place at UAL, so at the university. They often also took place in other places, in parks, shopping malls, churches. We've been to the Rudolf Steiner House in London. So we've tried to, whenever possible, to take it out. And we've tried to, whenever possible, to invite as broad as possible participants, that they're not just artists or musicians or academics, but actually to intrigue and interest all sorts of people. I think another thing I'm working on is a sonic pedagogy. I'm working on with wonderful people. We just had some study days. Nicole Brittingham Furlong, Walter Gershon, and so on, people who've been working on sonic pedagogy for a while, to remedy this over emphasis of the visual in school, even from primary age, and bring in the sensory, the embodied knowledge that sound can bring, which we believe is beneficial also to, say, exclusion from schools, how children get excluded if they do not grasp the semantic knowledge fast enough. So, because if we had a sort of if we learned the sonic sensibility and sonic knowledge from primary school or even kindergarten onwards, obviously we would embrace it very differently. So I think it's a paradigm shift and it's a cultural shift, and we all need to kind of work on it in various ways, and as we can carry it out there through participatory practices, lobbying, advocacy, trying things out. And I don't see another way, frankly.
Thank you. Thank you, Karina, for your question. And now we have Francisco.
Hello, can you hear me well?
Yes.
Yep.
Well.
Thank you first for the talk and also for your moderation, Danielle. And I would like to ask you, because you talked about volumes and the immersive,
Yes.
and I'm just wondering, as artists, how can we move from the immersive to the use of volumes? It's just a change of vocabulary, or do we need to change something in our practice?
I think it's a bit of a sleight of hand. So it's a bit of it's not cheating, but it is changing the vocabulary. And I sort of I can't do this well on the computer. It's like doing a bit of a Derridian erasure with immersiveness. So I'm deleting it, but it's still there. It is still there in a way because, of course, there is in the volume, in that relational sphere that we're together in, there is an immersion of sorts happening. But what I want to avoid, basically, is being hijacked by an agenda that sees immersion as passive, pacifying, druggy, taking people's agency. So I think in part, a shift actually in word can do a lot, because taking the word away or cancelling it, crossing it out, makes us think, well, what's my work actually like? Is my work immersive in that sort of passive sense? Or does my work compose spaces, rooms, volumes, within which I enable and are engaged through agency? So it's a bit of both, but it can start with the simple erasure of a word in order to rethink it. But I think it is important, to me at least, for my practice, it is important that don't get me wrong, at the moment with COVID and the depression that brings of being isolated all the time, I have developed a huge fondness for drone music. And the reason I like it is exactly because it makes me completely switch off. Maybe some other faculties switch on, but I enjoy that. It's the one way to let go of the computer screen, let go of the situation. I don't know whether that's immersive, but it's certainly a pacifier and a happy maker. But it's not maybe entirely what I want my own work to do.
Thank you, Salomé. We have another question from Beatriz now.
Hello.
Hi.
I think I do not have the best internet, but let's try. First of all, thank you for your talk. I think for some moments the screen mode just went away, and I think that's good. And my question is, if you see imagination as a tool, and if yes, how do you see it in the process of building this non-scientific mode of knowing through sound? Can you imagine it as a collective machine that can be revisited and updated between, not commas, but that other things? That's it, yeah.
So just to double check, so you're asking what the role of imagination in reaching this other knowledge?
Yes, if you believe it has a path to be accomplished. I'm asking this because sound is one of those things that can drive us to think without pictures, and including wondering about things whose experience we cannot prove.
Yes. Just to clarify, I do not mean that sonic knowledge is non-scientific. The very opposite. It gets to its scientific way in a different way.
Yeah, sorry. My question was wrong in that sense, because what I wanted to say is that we need to validate other languages of knowledge, right?
Absolutely, yes.
So it's in that sense.
Yeah, so because in science, the objectivity is found in the systematic and the readability of the thing that I have found out, that I know, and I can repeat it, and that verifies its knowledge. Whereas I think in sound, the the systematic is not found in systematizing it, but in a rigorous practice. So a rigorous practice to me justifies or gives the knowledge of sound just as much credibility. And I think imagination is an interesting word. Again, it is probably a word that deserves the scrutiny that immersiveness does, because it is another word that is so quickly abused and so quickly taken into the realm of the esoteric and the not worthwhile, and the feminine, which is, also considered in excess often not worthwhile. If we look at, Ellen Sixou's writing, she says that very beautifully. And so imagination is a very difficult term, but I do think in principle, yes, imagining the process, the practice of imagining is very important for us to get to these other knowledges. But maybe we could, instead of imagining, we could call it reorientations and disorientations and rethinkings and practices of thinking and feeling things differently. Because that, I guess, is what the sort of continuous sonic practice demands, that we can't see, we can't for certain say, oh, look, that's that over there. Now I know it's there, that's what it is, finished. I am involved, and I understand that my understanding of that thing that I hear says as much about me as it does of that thing, because I can't be sure what it is unless, the sound of a car. It shows me my involvement in how I know things and what I know. So I think that's the strength of sound, where it makes us acutely aware of, through the doubt and the insecurity of what I actually hear, it makes us aware of how perception is a reciprocal thing that I'm involved in, and that I therefore have responsibility for. And yes, that is an imagination. If it's contextualized in that way, it is a different imagination of how I know the world. And so yes, it is, when written about in a nuanced way and carefully, not to be carried off in criticism, an important word. I hope that was sort of an answer.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Salomé. We are running out of time. I will give you the voice to a final question from Vasco, and I'm sorry that people that still wanted to make questions both on Zoom and Facebook, but we can't go on after the last question from Vasco. Vasco?
Sorry,
okay.
can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening, everyone. This is not really a question. This is just a note I made during the presentation that I didn't quite understand. It's about the cartographic knowledge and the desire to suppress the knowledge. And I don't know what is this origin of the desire to suppress the knowledge, if it has anything to do with the cartographic and the visualizations, the graphics. And I just wanted to make this point clear, that I didn't quite understand.
Yeah, I didn't mean to say that there was a suppression of cartographic knowledge, but rather that cartography, for example, was one example of where we all know how to read a map. We can find ourselves on the map, and maps abstract and make where a country is, seemingly very clear, without us ever having to know what the country is like. And obviously map making, and Michel Foucault says that very, very eloquently. He brings it back to the military, that it was a military pursuit to have maps, and a colonial pursuit. In order to colonialize a country, you need a map. You need a map to know where it is, and then you need a map to go and get it. And so he reminds us of this military history of cartography, and Doran Massey then continues this dialogue, if you will, and reminds us that maps do not only just represent the world, they actually make the world, because, and that goes back to, I think it was Beatrice or Karina's point, about the imagination, because it's how we can imagine the world. We can't imagine the world in any other way. And Doran Massey does this very interesting. She shows this map of Mexico City by the then indigenous people and by the colonializers, and she juxtaposes them. And it is fantastically interesting what a different imagination, a different view, a different idea they had about that land, that territory, the ones who lived in it on a daily basis and the ones who wanted it and capture it and have it. So cartographic knowledge, or the cartography, is one visualization of a knowledge of a world that we live in, and that as a lived in, inhabited world is much more complex than any map could show us. And yet it makes us feel we know the world if we look at a globe. And so I'm not saying we shouldn't have maps, but I'm saying we could sonically perform them. We could have a performative geography where it's about encounters, and social geography obviously does that. It digs deeper, it undoes the maps, it thinks about how people live together economically, in all sorts of aspects. And I think that's very important, because that's how we also come to understand the difficult lines of maps, say the partition between Pakistan and India, or the partition between the West Bank and Israel, or the wall in Mexico. These are all difficult difficult lines drawn on a map that on a map might seem very innocent or just a line, but that have histories and stories and memories and a complexity and a plurality of knowledge attached around them, that I think we need to go further than the map, basically. So I didn't want to disrupt, but maybe augment cartography.
Thank you very much, Salomé. I think we are ending now. Thanks again for the wonderful conference, and mostly this final conversation that I think it was very, very good. Thank you for your patience regarding our technical problems, but mostly your generosity on answering our students' questions. I think it was a great hour and a half that we passed here, although the technical problems. So thank you, Salomé, again.
Thank you, and thank you for wonderful questions and a great introduction, and a very enriching evening for myself as well. Thank you.
Okay, so before we end, I just want to remind you that next week we have another talk in this program curated by Diogo Tudela and José Alberto Gomes. On March 18, we will have Amina Abbas Nazari, and he will speak about phonocentric adventures in fiction design. So see you around, and thank you very much.